It's very exciting for us and a deep honor to have this conversation between a bishop and a general, two friends talking about peace. General James Mattis, U.S. Marine Corps retired, returns to Stanford as the Davies Family Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution after having served with distinction as the nation's 26th Secretary of Defense. General Mattis commanded at multiple levels in his 43-year career as an infantry Marine. As a general, he served concurrently as the commander of U.S. Joint Forces Command and as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation. Before retiring in 2013, he was the commander of U.S. Central Command, directing military operations for over 200,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, and Marines, and allied forces across the Middle East. He's co-editor of the book Warriors and Citizens: American Views of Our Own Military, and we are so grateful that you're here with us tonight.
The Right Reverend William E. Swing is the president and founding trustee of URI. Bishop William Swing had the original vision of URI in 1993 in response to an invitation from the United Nations, which asked him to host an interfaith service honoring the 50th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. Bishop Swing served as the Episcopal Bishop of California from 1980 until his retirement in 2006. In that capacity, he was a national and international leader in response to the AIDS crisis, co-founded Episcopal Community Services to address San Francisco's homeless problem, and co-founded Community Bank of the Bay to support local businesses and the economy.
After the conversation on stage, we will ask you if you have any questions to write them on a piece of paper, which you should all have a pad in your conference bag. And then there will be people in the aisles collecting them during the time, and then I'll be able to ask them at the end of the conversation. Bill, Jim, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Before we get started, I just want to say that if you look in the book of Acts of the Apostles, there's one scene in there where somebody from the Apostolic community is talking to somebody from the military community of the Roman Empire. So a bishop and a general talked before. And they got in the Bible, so Jim maybe, I don't know. The Hebrew scriptures say, in a couple of places, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to war. In the Bible, war is expected and important. Even at the end of the Bible, it says there was war in heaven. So, from Cain and Abel to the last book of the Bible, violent confrontation is a given. This evening, I would like to make a case for the opposite of war, which is peace. I speak of peace from a religious perspective as a Christian, as a bishop, and an interfaith leader. I often hear people say, well, most wars are usually caused by religions. But that is not true. At least it is not true in the 4 volumes of the Encyclopedia of Wars. The authors state that from 3,500 years BC till today, there have been 1,763 wars. Only 123 of them were started for religious reasons. That means less than 7% of all wars are religiously based. Christianity, for the first 300 years, was a pacifist religion. And why? because Jesus, the Christ of Christianity, chose not to fight. One of his most famous messages was, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." And by far his most telling moment came when one of his followers pulled out a sword and cut off the ear of an adversary. Jesus told his followers to put the sword away. Big line. Sheathe your sword. Put the sword away. There's another way, a better way. And when Jesus rose from the dead, the first word that he said was peace. It's all over. Peace. The war's over. After 300 years of being a reviled and persecuted religion, the pacifist Christianity changed radically because it was embraced by the Roman Empire and became the favored religion of the empire. So the Roman Empire and its constant wars were wed to the man of peace and his religion of peace. You put them together and something had to give. The compromise, or the accommodation, in the 4th century is what we are still living with today. In short, we are living today with the just war theory of the 4th century. The theory that admits that nations have to choose between two evils. And whether you choose this or you choose that, it'll still be evil. Even it's the better choice. Protecting innocent lives and defending moral values drives us, on occasion, to insist on the use of force and violence, even when peace is the final objective. Now, I, personally, feel that haunting necessity to compromise between the church and the state, between peace and war. I live in Burlingame, California, and when I drive to work in San Francisco, I pass 2 military cemeteries every day. The first is the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, and I look out the window and my eyes scan the grave markers of 145,000 gravestones. And just before I arrive at my office in the Presidio, I see 26,400 grave markers in the San Francisco National Cemetery. All of those white markers catch my eyes, and my heart skips every time. And I wonder, who were all those women and men? Why were they willing to be ready to die for their country? Such thoughts are similar when I look at the Christian cross of death and resurrection, and I ponder the nature of the sacrifice being made there. Was Jesus giving his life for his country, for his religion, or something bigger? The soldier dies for an understandable peace. Jesus dies for a peace that passes all understanding. When I stop my car in the URI office, then it's a new day. There's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is that Jews are mowed down at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Christians are killed at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Muslims are slain in Christchurch, New Zealand. Wait a minute. Is there a religious war going on? Well, not a war, but there is a rising tide of religiously motivated violence where deranged individuals, provoked by religious zealots, racial bigots, and cultural warriors, they think that what they are doing is the will of God by murdering innocent people. Somebody had better do something about that, or there will never again be a moment's peace in a movie theater or a school or a sporting events or a restaurant or a subway or a house of worship. That's the bad news. The good news is that when I step in my office, I hear stories of people from all over the world, of all the religions and most of the indigenous tribes and many of the humanistic movements who have come together in more than half the countries of the world. And they are taking positive actions to build up their local communities. They plant trees, they build schools, they start musical groups, they gather mothers in conflict zones, they protect journalists, they film local scenes of peacemaking, they advocate for marginalized people, they engage in conflict resolution, and thousands of other pursuits. They make peace, and they are peace, and they are URI. Before a war, during a war, and after a war, they represent the glue that holds the community together. And they give rise to hope in devastating circumstances. None of this is based on the supposed superiority of one nation or one religion or one ethnic culture. All of it assumes that there's never going to be an exclusive peace. The only peace that endures is the inclusive peace. Somebody had better do something about that. And that's what URI does. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Well, thank you, Bishop Swain. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank all of you for including me here today. The head of the Parliament, good to see you here, ma'am. It's a strange journey. I was thinking as I was listening to the bishop, how did a guy who's last taking part in a church service himself as a 16-year-old altar boy in an Episcopal church on the Columbia River end up here today? And it's been a strange route to get here, to close the gap between us a little and remove some of the distance. I was a young guy growing up on the Columbia River. I had my whole life planned out. I was going to go off to college. I was going to come back and teach physics and teach history and coach American football at high school that I grew up in. There was something, however, called conscription, the draft going on at that time. And so as a way to do my patriotic chore, I decided I would go down and do a couple of years in the Marine Infantry, and ended up staying for some 4+ decades in the infantry. I did so, ladies and gentlemen. I stayed in that poor-paying outfit simply because I had a joy of serving alongside the rambunctious, high-spirited, and selfless young infantrymen. They get their name, infantry, from infant soldier, young soldier. That's how they were named. Most of them are not old enough to drink a beer legally in California. Once in a while, they determine a way to do so, I might add. But I didn't like some of the jobs I was in. At age 21, as a second lieutenant overseas with my 40 sailors and Marines, I grew to hate minefields immensely. But I came to love young people who would not want to let each other down and would crawl forward into minefields. And based on that, I stayed with that outfit for a long time. I fought many times. I'll be right up front with you. I'm not going to patronize you. I fought many times in several wars. I fought more battles than I can recall. But it was always alongside Allied forces. I never fought in an all-American formation, not a single time. I fought with soldiers of different creeds, different religions, different ethnicities, and I learned respect in the most neighborly way around tables and around campfires and around maps and in terrible conditions. And you learn how people coming from opposite ends of the earth can work together in common cause, whether that cause is one that that grabs you or not, it was still a common cause that brought us all together, even when the dignity of danger had to confront every one of their decisions. I would tell you that if there is one enduring lesson I think you would find from any of us who served through those circumstances, it's the compassion you feel for the civilians who always pay the heaviest price in war. Certainly militaries pay a heavy price. We expect it. We know we're not part of a life insurance corporation, but to see civilians huddled around what was left of their homes, to see them leaving with nothing but what they have on their back, it was impossible to distance yourself from the idea that this could have been your family. And so what does this have to do with making peace or making a better world or accelerating peace? I saw the words up here on the screen when I walk in. In those years, as I sailed around the world, I was in a naval force, the Marines. We deploy on ships, and we were pulling people out of the South China Sea who were the residue, the wreckage of war again. As I saw people living in poverty, refugees in a plight so bad I haven't the words to describe it, it became clear to me that through my own experience, through the wars I was seeing and my study of history, that it was very, very clear what happens when women lose faith and reason. And how do you restore a faith and reason? Because what reasonable person could wish that upon themselves, upon others, with all the unpredictability, the fundamental unpredictability of war, which means once you open that box, nobody is really in control of it. What do you do when people lose their moral bearings? And war, being what it is something that will scrape the veneer of civilization off the toughest, most moral being and leave bare what's underneath. Fortunately, most of the time it leaves bare something good, but not always. And what happens when we refuse to listen to our better angels and we say we're going to war when we have not exhausted other alternatives to resolve conflict? In our own country, we had the case where Abraham Lincoln, deep in the Civil War, the worst war our country ever fought, a reminder of what civil wars can unleash in terms of hatred. He had seen what brutality could do to soldiers' hearts, and in the midst of that war, in 1863, 2 years into that terrible war, an order came out of the Department of the Army with his thumbprint on it, and in there is a sentence that I quote, "Men who take up arms do not cease to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God." And I bring this up because I believe this larger responsibility is in the tradition of the U.S. military. We're not the perfect guys. I don't believe any of us are perfect, but we are the good guys, and we try to live up to these kind of moral precepts. The larger responsibility, of course, for all of us in this room, all of us who have gotten to my color hair, and certainly, hopefully, you younger ones too, that we turn over to the next generation a situation where conflicts are prevented, the conflicts that thrust our peoples and our troops into these circumstances. And that's why when Bishop Swain called, I was willing to come talk here today, even if it seems to be a meeting of two different camps. My view of America is one of one great big experiment. That's all it is an experiment to see if a government of the people, by the people, for the people can exist, if it can keep itself together, if it can maintain its respect for each other and its respect for other countries. We have something on the coin of every coin in your pocket. If you've been to a vending machine here, it says e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And I bring this up because we are made up of every creed, every kind of mixture of the world is here in our country, of course, and surely a country that's constructed such as this would default to peace if guided by rational, moral, and ethical leaders. Yet it doesn't always happen, and we know it, and this is where your mission becomes more clear. It becomes more accelerated in its own way, because we live in an age where it seems like more and more people are losing faith in reason. Evil does exist. I do not say it does not. I do not say we're going to have a world completely free of war. I think it would be a great thing if we did, but I've also read enough history to know that history does not go one direction or another. When people say that someone's on the wrong side of history, it's usually because they think they're on the right side, and so anybody against it's going the wrong way. The challenge with that is, I've read enough history to know that history is written by good men and women and by bad men and women. And if good men and women don't come together to deter war, to guide our history, then we are going to end up in a position where we'll probably have more wars. Military leaders have responsibilities, I believe, as much to support peace as to fight wars. I think Gandhi was right. He was correct when he said seasoned soldiers yearn for peace. Seasoned soldiers yearn for peace. And the reason is we have seen the degree of maliciousness and the ugliness of the fight. It is not a theoretical thing. It's not something we picked up from a movie. It's not something we heard someone bear witness to. We have seen it in our own eyes. It's very hard to disbelieve what you have seen with your own eyes. And as President Lincoln demonstrated deep into a war, we're going to have morally sound basis for military service if we're going to restore peace, maintain peace, and make certain that we can keep peace sustained long enough that it actually digs in roots. It grows roots, and we can hopefully reduce the opportunities where conflict through war is the only way to resolve things. I eventually rose in the military. I had very modest expectations. I'd stick around for a little while. I came up to high rank, and at one point, as you heard from Victor, I was commanding 250,000 U.S. and Allied troops across the Mideast. So you must think, well, that was my job. That was not my job. I could do that part of my job in 15 minutes a day, sign an order, do something like that. My real job was how do you keep the peace, in my case in the Middle East, which is the area that I was responsible for, how do you keep what passes for peace or try to hold on to peace for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, while the diplomats work their magic and keep them in a position of authority. Make it very clear, in my case, you really want to work with the diplomats. You don't want to work with the guys who work with me. And you do this, I think that we have as much a role in the military, in peacekeeping and peacemaking as it does in war, because the entire purpose of fighting when you do it is try to restore a better peace. You're not just there to fight a war. You need a better peace to grow out of it. And so how you fight that war is also very, very important. I was on more humanitarian operations in my first 10 years in the Naval Service than I was in combat operations. I bring this up because there are many times people see the military beyond the pale. I've seen it in our own churches. I've had my own troops come to me and tell me that they were not welcome in some of their churches on occasion when they went home. I've seen them put beyond the pale, and I want all of you to know that I speak as an advocate for them. Believe me, as the clock ticks down and they're laying on the line of departure or getting on the helicopters and that sort of thing, they're not looking forward to what's coming right then. They'll do it, but it's a very, very tough thing, and they could use the kind of support of the organization like this and the ones you represent as they try to hang on to that great big experiment, that experiment of a country of the people, by the people, for the people, so you have the freedom to meet in peace today here at Stanford University. So I know how to fight, ladies and gentlemen, and I just want you to know I vote for peace. I vote for what you're doing. I salute what you're doing. I endorse it, and I hope we have some good questions coming up here. Thank you. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is General Mattis and I are going to have some questions and answers here between the two of us. And if you have a question for General Mattis, write it down. If you have one for me, just forget it. But if you have a good question for him, write it down. And we have some people, just hold it up, and some people will pick it up. And the last 15 minutes will be questions from the audience to us, actually. But I have some questions. The first one, this is a long question. In World War II, when I was a boy, I carried the American flag in the church procession on Sundays. The congregation sang, "Onward, Christian Soldiers." The congregation each Sunday sang, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." Men and women in our congregation volunteered to fight and, if necessary, die for their country. From that moment of time, things began to change when the Vietnam War came along. "Onward, Christian Soldiers" was dropped from the hymnal. Military metaphors were dropped from our prayers, and a deep suspicion between the church and the military set in. My question, can this marriage be saved? Or should it? I ask that respectfully.
Well, I wonder if that question's best directed to your community. When the time comes that a religion cuts out part of its own congregation, or decides that some people are beyond, I don't know, salvation, beyond community, then the alienation that occurs, we should not be surprised that that alienation will result in people who are brought up lacking what moral precepts are available, thanks to a church long steeped in study of peace, in study of how to conduct a moral life. So I would not answer the question. I think it's something that the church itself has to answer. Why would it, out of a understandable repulsion against war, why would they declare war on their own people?
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Second question. It was postulated by some that there could be no rules in war. If the enemy declines to fight respecting the Geneva protocols, that exempts us from doing the same. They go on to say that if the enemy doesn't fight according to such rules, we endanger ourselves by doing so. How do you respond to that?
Well, the Geneva Protocols, we're all aware these were efforts to try to prevent harm to the innocents on the battlefield. And again, most of the people who are injured on the battlefield are on the humanitarian field. A battlefield is always at the same time a humanitarian field, especially today when we're up against enemies who intentionally hide behind women and children and fire from those positions. And so you'll hear people say, well, we can't obey the rules because the enemy isn't. Well, that would mean to give the moral high ground to the enemy. You are now going to do what the enemy has directed you to do because the enemy's not obeying the rules. Somehow you're not going to obey the rules to try to protect the innocent. And I have seen many, many cases where just the opposite happens. Because we try to protect the innocent, when the fighting is over, they recognize the difference. And in that difference is why one village at a time, one tribe at a time, moves over to our side. Even when we're, for example, in the heart of the Middle East, and we're thrust into a war there, and even there, we were able to make common cause with people because we stayed true to our values. We did not surrender them. Did it cost us some of our troops' lives? It certainly did. Were there times when we could have made a lower casualty cost on ourselves? Of course there was. That is what we do. We train our people to take those risks. There's any number of tactical ways to do it, but at times you simply lose people. That's a reality. But at the same time, we are not going to surrender who we are to a merciless enemy and somehow, because they say they're devout, somehow give them any kind of dignity for their position. The bottom line is, if someone targets women and children, they are not devout. I don't care what the definition is in the dictionary. That is not a devout religious person that targets innocent women and children. And so we must not allow our troops to go down that route. And we want them to come home and able to be proud of who they are. And hopefully their church will embrace them when they come home for having done the right thing.
Good. Using some of your metaphor earlier, My hunch is that wars are won one village at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one street at a time, and finally one house at a time. For me, that seems the same way that peace is won. One village at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one street at a time, one house at a time. Ultimately, peace that endures has to be made in close encounters among families and neighbors. Does that make any sense?
I think it's irreplaceable that we have got to have a sense of family, a sense of community, a sense of friendship, fundamental friendship, and fundamental respect. But I would not allow leaders to abrogate their responsibility from the top down to set the conditions that remove the hatred, that build the sense of common bonds between nations. There are nations right now where we have got very, very strong military relations right now as we're sitting here. And yet the political relations between our countries are rocky at best. So I think it's contingent on everyone, whether it be United Religions or it's political leadership, military leadership. We all need to roll our sleeves up and work on this. This isn't something we assigned to somebody else. Universities have to do it. Everyone's got to be part of this. The idea that this can be farmed out, allocated out to someone else, and they're going to take care of the peace problem is an abrogation of responsibility. So you have to have this local effort, but it does not take up all the slack that needs to be taken up if you're going to take the heat and venom out of this, out of these relations.
Good, thank you. Last question, and then we'll have questions from the audience. How do you message your troops to keep their moral balance on a battlefield? When commanding thousands of troops spread over thousands of miles, how do you align them with a moral balance thinking?
Well, again, they're very, very young troops by and large, and so you have to hit both their head and their heart. The Marines, the Navy will deliver to us in the field well-disciplined young men and women. They know how to obey orders. They know how to use their weapons so they're not used in a irresponsible manner. That comes to you. But I often had to go to words in antiquity in order to get across what I wanted. I'll give you the example of when we first went in to Afghanistan. My point was that I wanted to be either the best friend or the worst enemy. When it came to Al-Qaeda, they were going to regret what they did on 9/11, and we were going to stop them from doing it again. But for all of those villagers who had Al-Qaeda living amongst them, I wanted them to see a weapon-carrying Marine walking through their village as someone there to protect them, not someone to scare them. So you had to teach them discrimination right up front. You had to teach them, don't allow the enemy to get you to hate these people. They want you to hate them. They are going to try to set off bombs along the roadway so that when you go into the village, you hate people. We would have to talk with them about it. We'd give them vignettes. We'd actually have stories told in the evening after training. We'd say, here's what happened, and talk them through it, because for many of them it was their first ethical lessons ever, which says something about the school system that we were recruiting from. Another one I used was from the doctor's oath, the physician's oath, the first do no harm. If you see a terrorist across a crowded marketplace, then don't take the shot and take a chance on hitting a woman or a child. Hunt him down another day and get him, but don't do it. A lot of it was teaching tactical patience. It was teaching them that what they had to do was come home and, in the words of the Marines hymn, keep their honor clean. They could not come home and be ashamed of what they'd done, because it's a much longer, at times impossible recovery period because of it. The more you could talk thematically to them like this and get them talking back with you across the gap of rank, the more they understood the responsibility they had. And in war, it is often just one big mess, one after another. You had to somehow be able to go down there too when they tried their best and they'd made a mistake and tell them it's okay, you did the best you could, you're going to be okay, so that they didn't fall into that abyss of darkness where now it becomes the default position. But I often had to use words from antiquity because they seem to have a longer dwell time in the lads' minds. And so I would do it that way. And nothing makes up then for having very, very strong-willed young sergeants, young 20, 25-year-old sergeants who are keeping an eye on everything going on. And a lot of your hopes and prayers are carried on the shoulders of those very, very young sergeants who are out there on the front line. And you've got to have that ethical stance for them more than anyone else, because they will impose it. They're not soft people. They will maintain the discipline, but it's absolutely essential when you have 19-year-olds with automatic rifles out in a village.
Right. Victor, you're going to bring me some pieces of paper. In the meantime, I'd like to ask a question about, oh, you're there. Okay, go right ahead.
So first of all, I kid you not that about a third of the pieces of paper that came in were either asking you to or wondering whether you would be running for president in the hopes that you would. So we just put that, we'll put those aside. I'll give those to you later. They're right here. There were two groupings of questions that I'll ask. I think the first one has to do with the relationship between the military and diplomacy, which you spoke a bit about. But a number of people said that there seems to be a large gap between that in the public's eye, not just here, but in other countries in the world, where the assumption is that the military and the diplomatic side are somehow either so isolated from each other or in conflict with each other. Could you speak a little bit about the relationship, the important relationship between those two worlds?
Bishop Swain mentioned the impact of Vietnam on our country, and I think it was very accurate the way he put it. I think that what has happened over the years, that especially in the Western democracies, as they have ceased teaching, by and large, studying military history, they have become more and more aligned diplomatically with one of two approaches: economic sanctions or regime change. And one of those two is the military, of course, regime change. There are a host of traditional diplomatic tools. We no longer use them. And because of that gap now, you can see the military way over here, the diplomacy way over here, and there the twain shall meet. When you get into that position, you can't put two and two together. You'll actually have people go fight a war, then say the war's over, we're coming home, and we come home, and 3 years later, the enemy comes right back, and the poor people who've just been freed are once again under the thumb of terrorists. We saw this happen. There's got to be an integration. There's got to be a study, an integrated study. We've got to get back to saying we have to study military history. There is no moral high ground to being ignorant of it, and try to bring diplomacy and military operations back together, because I think we'll use the military less if we diplomatically engage more. It's very simple. There's so much of it.
Probably the majority of the questions, and it may have to do with the session that preceded it, have to do with nuclear weapons. And have to do with the adoption of no first use policy, have to do with balance of power questions, have to do with questions about what authority or how does it work in terms of in the United States with the president and nuclear. Could you comment on, and one has to do with your own sense of, would you like to see the elimination of nuclear weapons? As you've thought about this, as others around you have, could you comment on that?
I think all of us would love to see this burden off us. I mean, if there was not a nuclear weapon in the world, I can't believe that anyone would be missing them. There are those who say if one other guy's got it, then he's got to have it. But if they were all gone, I think it would relieve so much in the world. I don't know how to get there. I know the path. The path should be to maintain the deterrent. I believe this. But then redouble the non-proliferation and redouble the arms control efforts with step by step. I don't care how long it takes. Well, I do care, but so long as the trajectory is going in the right direction, it will build momentum. It will build support. Because I don't see people running down the road with signs saying, hooray for nuclear weapons. It is not something that's going to be hard to build support if we go the right direction. But having arrived in Washington and found very little going on nuclear arms control, little over 2.5 years ago when I got there, I was flabbergasted that what had become almost a flagship part of our diplomacy under Secretary Shultz, under President Reagan, where we dropped by over 2/3 of all the nuclear weapons in the world. The trajectory was right, and I don't know what happened to it, but it scared me that everybody I talked to about it was older than I was. That scared the dickens out of me. We need young people who are going to be brought up, again, recognizing in this crummy world, you take the crummy parts on. You don't just say, I'm too good for that. Take on the nuclear part. Take it on, but don't do it in a wishful way. Do it in a pragmatic way. But I would love to see us get back on the track where we have a deterrent so the weapons are never used. All that's there is to buy time until arms control and reduction can get going the right way again.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you raised the quote from Gandhi, because that has always been such an important one, that those closest to war and those in the military know the horror of war. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of questions to you about what you see as the greatest threats to peace or challenges to peace from the perspectives that you've seen in the world in your time.
Yeah, very simply the lack of respect for one another. It starts there, it grows out, it's contempt for each other's beliefs, it's a lack of willingness to listen to each other today. I see it in all walks of life, and I think those are the seeds for what is becoming a much more violent response, is this lack of respect and this, I would even say, alienation that you see in so many people today. I mean, we watch suicide rates and drug use going up among our young and old. It's as if we've forgotten how to be human beings with each other. And I think it goes back to respect. You got to ask the bishop some of these questions. He's getting off easy.
Well, this is my favorite. My favorite one, actually, because one of the ones is is General Mattis. Do you have a really difficult question for Bishop Swing?
It's time for dinner, I think. Yeah.
Not quite yet. So one of my the things that I appreciated most in getting into the interfaith world was from my dad, who was in the Navy, career Navy person for much of his life. And his friendships that he made were largely from that time in his life. And they were friends with people of all over the world, of all religions, of all traditions. Mm-hmm. And in the United States, the earliest institutional form of interfaith work was the military chaplaincies. Mm-hmm. The military chaplaincies were actually the model that the campus ministries are now, the interfaith ministries are built off of. A lot of our community interfaith work is built off of. From your experience within the military, what do you see as interfaith and the interfaith dynamics that you witnessed over your career?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, of course, we self-select where we go to worship in the civilian world. But before you cross the line of departure, before you're leaving the ship, getting on the helicopter to go into a fight, oftentimes you do not know the denomination of the chaplain of your battalion. You're assigned them willy-nilly, the usual crazy military personnel system, you know. So you may have a Jewish chaplain, or you may have a Baptist chaplain. You may have a born-again kind of guy, or somebody steeped in the high church of the Roman Catholic Church. We've got Muslim chaplains. That's the chaplain. You go to see the chaplain before we land and clear it all out, you know, because you're going in. And it is an interesting point that we take it for granted in the military, the way we take so many things for granted about the equality of each other, because the commitment of each other to the mission is the same for the 17-year-old who's landing as it is for the 67-year-old general who is landing. That commonality gives you a common heritage, basically, and those friendships, Victor, I'm not surprised your father's friendships lived the rest of his life from those days, because they cross national lines. I've had friendships with people I couldn't even speak their language, but if we see each other again at a conference in Brussels or something years later, we smile knowingly at each other and say, yep, there you are again. You know, who would have believed we got promoted, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about military service, not necessarily the draft, but some kind of, your government asks you to do a service for 2 years. Mm-hmm. So maybe you don't go to the military, but you go to something. But if there's nothing other than the military, then generation after generation come along without any sense of duty to the nation.
Yeah.
And so a lack of patriotism is the final product of that, I think. What do you think about some kind of other service than the military service?
Yeah, I think whether it's teaching on an Indian reservation or inner city school, it's helping out at old folks' homes, hospice. You know, a country to me is like a bank. If you don't put something into it, you can't take something out of it. We got a lot of people taking out of it and not putting into it. So there's something about it, as much as we groused when we were getting drafted and all, there was a sense of obligation, and it was not a good time, as you know, during the Vietnam War. But when you got there, there was a sense that coming out of that, you had changed, and you had changed for the better. You changed for the better because you could no longer be as caught up in yourself. You couldn't be. For one thing, as George Schultz would tell you, gunnery sergeants in the Marine Corps are not there to help you through your midlife crisis. You know? So when they go after you, that you suddenly decided to give 99% effort on that obstacle course instead of 100, then obviously there's something wrong with you, and the conversation would go downhill from there. But what it does when you get out and the terrain at night, you're going down the road, you see somebody pulled over on the side of the road with a flat tire, you don't start sucking your thumb and drive by, you pull over and you help them. In other words, it creates a sense of selflessness that is actually practiced in you. So whether it's teaching or it's helping in some way, I think we've got to do something to remove this arrogance that, hey, we have all these freedoms, they just were given to us, and we don't owe anybody anything in return.
But
I'm with you.
But the government, yeah. But for the military, the government is the overarching institution that, but if you got into voluntary service or some kind of expectation by the government that you do a complementary service, the government would have to have a big vision, and there'd be a lot of money, a lot of administration, a lot of thought that would have to go into that. And if we don't do, is that an impossible dream?
Well, the LDS Church, of course, has its boys and girls go on mission. That's 2 years they have to give. School districts, this could be done, school districts are in every local town in America. School districts might be able to do it, where you would sign up for the following programs. They wouldn't be paid, perhaps, in some cases. In some cases, teaching on an Indian reservation, they would be, of course, under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But I think there's ways to do it, but I would not rely totally on the government to come up with something this large. I shudder when I think of that.
One final question for each of you as we close. In this moment in your lives, in this moment in history, when you wake up in the morning, from where do you draw hope?
Where?
do you draw hope? What gives you hope?
Mostly the young people, if we will tell them what we should tell them. They can handle it. They don't need safe space. They do not need to be burped every time they turn around. They don't need that. I think we need to talk bluntly with them that we, the greatest generation, gave us a wonderful country with opportunity that we couldn't have dreamed of in the 1930s in the midst of a depression. They gave it to us. We need to tell them we've messed it up a little bit and you guys need to get it back, and then be really helpful to them, listen to them, coach them, help them, coach them. As George Washington put it, listen to them, learn from them, help them, then lead them. And that's what gives me hope. I was in the infantry for all those years, and you can't be around 18, 19-year-old young guys under the conditions they lived and the circumstances they faced without being hopeful. So I know we can do it. Good luck to you all, ladies and gentlemen.